You won't believe what happened after the CEO's funeral. And honestly, I couldn't believe it myself when the lawyer slipped the envelope into my hands and told me to keep it quiet for now. Everyone else was crying, whispering about legacy, about the man who built an empire from the ground up, but me. I was just staring at that folded paper inside my jacket pocket. The one that revealed the truth that would shake the entire boardroom to its core. 51%. More than half. Majority control. I kept repeating that number in my head, barely hearing the priest's words, barely noticing the lavish casket being lowered into the earth, because all I could see was the weight of that power settling onto my shoulders. Nobody around me knew. Not the vice president who had been secretly gunning for control for years. Not the financial director who thought she could manipulate the shares into her favor. Not even the CEO's own children who believed bloodline would guarantee their inheritance. They all walked away from that gravesite thinking business would continue, as usual, that the hierarchy was intact. But I knew something they didn't, and I chose silence, because silence is the sharpest weapon when everyone else is speaking too loudly. The night after the funeral, as I sat alone in my apartment, I stared at the city skyline glowing against the dark, wondering how it would all unfold. Would I reveal my stake immediately and crush their ambitions with one simple declaration? Or would I let them crawl into the trap of their own arrogance and then flip the table at the right moment? My phone buzzed with messages from board members about scheduling the next emergency meeting. Their words dripping with subtle power plays, but all I could do was smile. They had no clue that their games were already lost before they even began. That night, as the rain tapped against my window, I rehearsed lines in my headlines, I might say, when the truth finally came out. Lines that would turn the smug looks on their faces into stunned silence. I could almost picture it, the shock, the confusion, the rage, but most of all, the fun. Yes, I thought, the next board meeting was going to be very, very fun. The days leading up to the board meeting were a theater of masks. Every executive playing their part as though the future of the company was a mystery written in the stars, when in truth it was written in the ink of the will folded neatly inside my locked drawer. I attended cocktail receptions where whispers of succession floated like smoke in the air. I watched as rivals clinked glasses with forced smiles, their eyes darting to each other's wallets more than to each other's faces. I stayed quiet, blending into the background, nodding at proposals that I already knew were irrelevant, laughing at jokes that would mean nothing once the gavel dropped in that boardroom. It's strange how power works when you don't have it. People overlook you, they underestimate you, they treat you like a pawn. But when you secretly hold it, the entire chessboard looks different. I walked the company halls and noticed the subtle ways employees aligned themselves, some drifting toward the loud vice president who barked orders like a general, others sliding toward the finance head who promised stability as though she wasn't plotting behind closed doors. Nobody suspected me, because why would they? I was the quiet one, the one who kept to himself, the one who never pushed too hard. That anonymity was my shield. Behind closed doors, I practiced reading their body language, preparing myself to counter each argument they would throw at the table. I knew the VP would bring up his vision, trying to impress the others with his grand promises. I knew the finance director would bring up numbers, charts, and forecasts, pretending to be the voice of reason. I even knew the CEO's eldest son would attempt a dramatic entrance, demanding control by birthright. But the truth was, none of their moves mattered anymore, because the majority was mine. I imagined their faces when I calmly slid the document across the polished mahogany table, the ink of the will shining under the overhead lights. I imagined their voices rising in protest, demanding verification, calling their lawyers, maybe even slamming fists in frustration. And I imagined myself, leaning back in my chair, unbothered, maybe even sipping water casually as the storm unfolded around me. They would soon realize that the person they overlooked, the person they underestimated, now held the crown. The quiet man in the corner was about to be king, and the irony was delicious. Each day that passed built the anticipation inside me, like a coiled spring, and by the time the official board meeting date arrived, I was no longer nervous. I was hungry. Hungry for the chaos, hungry for the moment of revelation, hungry for the silence that would fall when they realized the empire they thought was theirs was now mine. The morning of the board meeting felt like the air itself was heavier, as though the city had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. I woke early, not because of nerves but because anticipation doesn't let you sleep. I ironed my suit with a precision that bordered on ritual, tied my tie twice just to make sure the knot was flawless, and slipped the folded will into the inside pocket of my blazer where it rested against my chest like a secret heartbeat. The driver picked me up at 8, and as the car glided through the city streets, I watched towers of glass and steel rise into the sky, monuments to power and ambition. But I couldn't help smirking at how fragile those towers really were when one hidden piece of paper could determine who controlled them. Outside the headquarters, cameras flashed, reporters jostled to get a statement, and the executives arrived one by one, each performing their role in this unspoken play. The vice president strode in with his usual arrogance, nodding curtly at the cameras as though they were his audience. The finance director smiled for the press, radiating fake warmth that barely concealed her cold calculations. The CEO's children entered last, heads high, shoulders squared, already convinced the empire was theirs by blood. They didn't notice me slip in behind them, quiet and almost invisible. But then again, they never did notice me. Inside the boardroom, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne, the long table gleaming under the lights like a stage set for confrontation. I sat near the middle, close enough to watch them but not at the head. That spot was still empty, waiting to be claimed. Papers shuffled, water glasses clinked, and the low hum of voices filled the space until the chairman of the meeting called it to order. Instantly, the room shifted into battle mode. The vice president launched first, thumping his fist lightly on the table as he laid out his vision for the future, painting himself as the natural successor. Murmurs of agreement rippled from a few allies, though I noticed the skepticism in others' eyes. The finance director followed, with her spreadsheets and charts, speaking smoothly about stability and responsibility, subtly undermining the VP's recklessness. Then came the CEO's eldest son, dramatic as expected, rising to his feet with a practiced speech about legacy, honor, and bloodlines, his voice booming as though volume alone could secure power. Around the table, arguments sparked, alliances clashed, voices rose, and the storm I had anticipated unfolded exactly as I imagined. Through it all, I remained silent, hands folded, gaze steady, as though I were an observer rather than a participant. They barely acknowledged me, dismissing my presence as unimportant, which only made the truth burn brighter in my chest. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper in my pocket, and I knew the time was near. The room was a boiling cauldron of ambition, greed, and pride, and I was the lid about to be lifted. I waited, letting them exhaust themselves in their shouting, letting their egos collide until the air grew thick with tension, and only then did I lean forward slightly, clear my throat, and prepare to drop the truth that would silence them all. The sound of my throat clearing cut through the noise like a blade, sharper than I expected, and the chaos of voices paused mid-sentence. For the first time that morning, every eye turned to me. It was almost comical how quickly the silence fell, as though they suddenly remembered I existed. I let the quiet linger, savoring the weight of their stares, before reaching calmly into my blazer pocket. Their eyes tracked my hand as though I were pulling out a weapon, and in a sense, I was. Slowly, deliberately, I unfolded the document, laid it on the polished mahogany surface, and slid it toward the center of the table. Before we continue arguing about who deserves control, I said evenly, my voice steady but carrying enough force to echo off the walls, perhaps you should all see what the late CEO left behind. The vice president leaned forward first, his expression skeptical, but as his eyes scanned the words, the color drained from his face. The finance director snatched the paper next, her lips moving silently as she read, and by the time she looked up, her practiced composure was cracked, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The CEO's son yanked it from her grip, his booming voice reduced to a whisper as his gaze landed on the numbers 51%, majority control, mine. Around the table, the murmurs started, rising into protests, disbelief, demands for verification. This must be a forgery, someone spat. Impossible, another muttered. Lawyers were called for, phones pulled out, frantic texts sent, but I just leaned back in my chair unbothered, watching their world collapse in real time. When the shouting reached its peak, I raised a hand, and surprisingly, the room obeyed. I didn't plan to reveal this today, I said, my tone calm, almost conversational. But since everyone is so desperate to decide the future, you deserve to know that the decision is already made. The CEO trusted me with this responsibility. You, not the numbers, not the bloodline, me. The eldest son slammed his fist on the table, veins bulging in his neck as he shouted about family betrayal. But his voice cracked, desperation bleeding through the anger. The vice president stammered half-finished sentences, his confidence shattered. The finance director tried to recover her composure, but her eyes betrayed panic. I looked at them each in turn, savoring their collapse, and added softly, "You all treated me as if I was invisible. Maybe that was your biggest mistake." Silence followed, thicker than any argument, and in that silence I realized just how much had shifted. The empire they thought was theirs had slipped through their fingers without them even noticing. And now all eyes turned to me, not with dismissal, not with arrogance, but with fear and reluctant respect. The balance of power had changed in a single moment, and I was no longer the quiet man in the corner. I was the majority, the decision maker, the one who held the crown. The next board meeting, I thought, smiling faintly, wouldn't just be fun. It would be mine to command.